I always think this is one of the best ones to do these sessions on, because Macbeth is the one that has the broadest level of interpretation, right? Obviously, probably because it's the best written of all the ones that you do. So there's a lot you can come up with Macbeth, and therefore you can write at a very high standard at it, right? That's really, really, you can always approach it, and it's probably one of the, not easiest, but one that gives you the most scope to get up to a grade 9. Because if you do it well, you can do it really well. Now, you'll find there's a bunch of other lectures I've done in previous years on Macbeth. One that ties in very, very much with this was one I think I did last year on the supernatural. I did one as well, I think last year, on Macbeth and Banquo and their friendship. They're all very much, as I said, geared up to things that may well come up. And what I'm dealing with here today is one of the key kind of contextual areas that we have with Macbeth. It will come across a lot. And that is the idea of the gunpowder plot. Now, context is, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, always a really dangerous thing to write about at GCSE, because the tendency is to retell information. And what you always have to remember is who your audience is. Okay? The examiners know it better than you. So therefore, don't tell them stuff that they know. The only relevance to context is when it actually helps in terms of furthering your argument. And that's what I want to look at here today. I want to pose the question, basically, what is the significance of the gunpowder plot to the play of Macbeth? Okay? Now, we all know what the gunpowder plot is, I'm sure. But the key things for us to remember was, of course, it happened in the end of 1605, shortly before Macbeth was written. It was, at least the official story was, anyway, it was a Catholic conspiracy intended to kill the king, most of his family, and the whole nobility of England. It would have been, if it had succeeded, it would have been still today the biggest terrorist act in this country of all time. Okay, it would have probably also killed several thousand, possibly even 10,000 or more people in London, normal commoners in London as well. So it would have destroyed basically at one step the entire upper echelons of the country and created chaos. Now the idea was that was going to be followed by a rebellion, which actually was around here. Okay, it all started very much around here. And that was the idea of that was to re-establish England as a Catholic state. Now, again, maybe you'll be aware from your history that in the past, England had always been Catholic. It was the break from Rome with Henry VIII because he wanted to get divorced and the Pope would let him. It's a very simplistic version. That started a movement towards England becoming a Protestant country. By this time, it has been for 50 years or so. So by now, it's pretty much standard that this is not a Catholic country, but there are a bunch of Catholics in there. What then happened, of course, they found everybody who was involved in it. There were public trials and public executions, intended very much to stir up popular feeling against the people there. So this was a very, very major event. Okay, this, and I think this is actually a very, very apt comparison. It's essentially got the kind of the feel of what 9/11 was. Okay, the impact that had, except for the one big difference, of course, that nothing actually happened in the end. It just nearly did. Now, because it was seen as a Catholic conspiracy, and this is where the Catholicism bit comes in. You don't have to know loads of stuff about religion or whatever for this. But essentially, what it stirred up was a huge amount of anti-Catholic feeling across the country. In the same way that there was a massive Islamophobic reaction after 9/11, for example, okay, in a lot of places, not everywhere, of course, most people are more sensible than that. But you would have had a huge reaction to the idea of the fact that this was Catholics taking place. Now, England in itself always felt threatened by Catholicism anyway. It was far bigger than Protestantism. And there was what some people refer to as the evil empire, they called around, which was Spain, which was a massive empire at the time, the Pope himself, and they used to send across what they call Jesuit missionaries. Jesuit is a word for a kind of a particular sect of Catholicism, which is kind of fanatically devoted to the Pope, right? And was known for the Spanish Inquisition, things like that. That needs to know about. But thinking about all of those, England always felt threatened. It felt that they were ready to try and invade. All these missionaries were being sent in regularly underneath, to kind of like as spies, basically, to kind of disrupt from within. And in fact, most of them were caught and executed, but they were constantly sending more and more. And so England always felt that there was a danger in Catholicism anyway. There were constant plots against the throne, both for Elizabeth I before this and James I now. Constant little plots where Catholics were discovered to be plotting against them to try and reinstate the Catholic idea of the country. You've got to understand, religion was a massive deal here. There literally was no scope for not being religious, okay? And that's the key point. The Pope had declared previously, in the previous reign, that it was the duty of every Catholic basically try and kill Queen Elizabeth I. And you can imagine how that makes everybody in England feel, that their queen is essentially under death threat from the Pope. It's not going to make them feel good about it. Now, following on from the Gunpowder Plot, it got worse there. The anti-Catholic laws, and there were a number of anti-Catholic laws in place all the time anyway, but they were stiffened, and it was now required that it was always required that everyone attended church, and that was always a major issue. People who didn't attend church had to pay fines regularly every single time they didn't go, and many chose to do that. People who basically declared, I am Catholic, right? Which wasn't against the law. But I am Catholic and I don't want to go, I will therefore not go to a Protestant service, which was. But it then increased that they had to now swear an oath of allegiance. You're a recusant, if you didn't go to church, pay the fine, that's up to you. But you need to swear an oath of allegiance before you can hold any important post. And when I say important post, I mean lawyer, teacher, I mean literally any kind of job worth anything. So we were now in a situation where you can see how anti-Catholic feeling was spreading into legislation in the country. Yet there were actually only around 40,000 Catholics in the country by this point, most of them in the north. And actually, prior to the Gunpowder Plot, many of them were tolerated by their neighbours. In Stratford, for example, obviously Shakespeare's home, there were a number of non-Catholics, and most of the people around them just, they knew they didn't go to church, they paid their money, whatever, they didn't really care, right? In fact, sometimes they didn't even report them for not going to church. It was often an idea of tolerance until there's a threat, and that's what goes on here. So the Gunpowder Plot stirred up feeling that was already there, okay? And it was into this world that Macbeth was written. We'll come to Macbeth in a second and certain factual details about it. But the point, remember, behind all of this, because you're sitting there thinking, I'm sure I'm not going to repeat all of that factual information. Just told me not to. Absolutely. The point here is about this idea of level 6 critical response. That's what we're talking about, conceptual response. And a lot of critical responses that there are to Macbeth are based around an assumption that the Gunpowder Plot was central to everything. Here's 4 examples of quite widely held critical ideas that there are about Macbeth. Some critics, many in fact, argue that the point of Macbeth, it was written as a tribute to the king. Right now, remember, of course, Shakespeare was actually the king was his patron at the time, so it would certainly stand to his benefit for this to happen. The idea was that the play was deliberately there to reinforce his legitimacy and his divine right to rule. Because the historical Banquo, remember all of these characters were real people, the historical Banquo was believed to be an ancestor of King James. And by linking him to the defeat of Macbeth, he then is validating the Stuart dynasty. Remember that scene in Macbeth with the parade of kings when Macbeth demands to be shown if Banquo's children will ever reign his kingdom, and a parade of 8 kings, I think it is, come on, walking along the stage, all looking a bit like Banquo. The last one holding a mirror, right, which not only showed more of them, but was often held up, they reckon, in the direction of King James to again suggest that he was at the end of this line. So there's people who believe that the entire point of the play was to legitimise James's reign. Equivocation, which we'll come to in a minute. I'm sure most of you have studied the idea of equivocation. It's important. If you haven't, don't worry. We're going to come across it in a minute. Many people feel that that's at the heart of it. It's about equivocation and deception. Equivocation, as it says, originally was the use of ambiguous language to conceal the truth. Up until the Gunpowder Plot, that's all it was. It wasn't a very well-known word. But things exploded with the Gunpowder Plot for reasons I'll say in a minute. That's pun not intended. And it changed its meaning totally and became far more significant and important. So again, that supposedly comes out the Gunpowder Plot. Others say, similar to the first one, that this is a warning against regicide. Okay, that great chain of being argument that many of you will have heard about, right? That killing a king breaks the great chain of being and leads to chaos. And there's, again, other interpretations that suggest Macbeth should be seen as what we would now call a terrorist, because his motivations were very much the same as the Gunpowder Plot plotters. So you see, there's a lot of people who see this as central to the play and its existence. And that's what I want to deal with you today. I want us to think, is it? Is that what Macbeth is? Is it a Gunpowder Plot play? Is it an anti-Catholic play? Is that the reason for it being there? Or is there more to it than that? Because I'm sure you're going to make reference at some point to something connected to the Gunpowder Plot in your responses. Okay, so let's first of all take the case for the Gunpowder Plot having a massive impact on Macbeth. Right, here are the facts, I suppose, or closest anything to them, that suggest it's at the heart of what Shakespeare was trying to write. First of all, of course, it was written in 1606, or as far as we know it was, right? We believe it certainly was. And the Gunpowder Plot had failed in November 1605. So he's writing a play about the murder of a Scottish king about 6 months after a failed attempt to murder a Scottish king. People say, surely there's no coincidence there. And I think they're right. There cannot be a coincidence there. It cannot be that Macbeth, that Shakespeare chose to write his only play that he ever wrote set in Scotland in that circumstance. It must be quite deliberate. I'm sure of it. It was also written 3 years after the accession of King James from Scotland to the throne. So he was new in the throne. Okay, so again, anything suggesting his legitimacy as a king would be relevant at this point. And also at the same time, Shakespeare's acting troupe, the Lord Chamberlain's men, had at that point been taken over by the king. The king had chosen, obviously everyone would have wanted to be the king's men, chosen by the, to be his acting troupe, his patronage, and Shakespeare's were. That's a massive promotion for Shakespeare, a massive opportunity for him and for his group, his plays. But when you think about it, it also means King James is not only his king, but his boss. And therefore, you would think he is going to react to any attempt on his life. Okay? It's about a character who was best known in popular history at the time. Okay, Macbeth was a Scottish king. who's best known as a usurper. Usurper, somebody who takes the throne without actually having a proper succession, for that reason, steals the throne effectively. Something that happened in English history a number of times, always caused chaos, always caused disruption. Okay, so to write a play about a usurper getting removed and the rightful king coming in their place, a rightful king who's Scottish, is potentially going to be a part of that. As we said, King James claimed to be descended from Banquo himself, and Shakespeare actually changed Banquo's character. His source for the play was a text called Holinshed's Chronicles, we're pretty sure of, which told the story of Macbeth. Okay, not the real historical story. A lot of things have changed. Apparently, in history, Duncan wasn't a nice, kind ruler at all. Apparently, he was an awful ruler. Young, about the same age as Macbeth, quick to temper, and when Macbeth overthrew him, everybody was happy. And Macbeth apparently was a terrific ruler who ruled for years, and people loved him. But in Holinshed's account, pretty much everything that happens, including the witches and what they say, happens exactly the same, except for one thing. Banquo, in Holinshed, is a co-conspirator with Macbeth. He works with him the whole time. So that's a massive change that Shakespeare's made. And considering James claims descent from Banquo, changing him from a conspirator to the voice of reason sounds quite deliberate, doesn't it? You look at that evidence and it looks very, very much like, you're sat there convinced, aren't you? This is what Shakespeare was up to. He was basically buttering his own bread, right? This is going to work for me, right? Well, to add to that is this strange thing, equivocation. Now, you're going to deal with this, I would imagine, potentially a lot in your essay, the idea of equivocation. As I said to you before, it was a word that was barely used before this. It just literally meant saying something that sounds like one thing, but actually means something different. That's what it meant. But everything changed with the gunpowder plot, because in part of the investigations, as part of the investigations into what happened, a document was turned up in a Catholic household, and it was essentially titled A Guide to Equivocation. Somebody changed the title and tried to make it different, but anyway, A Guide to Equivocation. And it was there for Catholics to tell them how to equivocate. Now, the reason behind this is, remember, we are in a very religious time here, and therefore we're in a situation which, again, very strange to us, where something like lying just doesn't happen very much, okay? Because lying means to go to hell, right? So you don't lie. At the same time, Catholics are being persecuted. They're not allowed to practice being Catholic. They're not allowed to have Catholic services. But if they don't have Catholic services and they don't have priests and things, they don't have confession, things like that, then also they're going to go to hell. So what do? They sneak in priests. Many of you will know this story of seen houses locally with the priest holes and things like that, where they could hide a priest away so that no one could find them, right? So if people came banging at the door saying, you've got somebody here, which happened a lot because people told on their neighbours, and also they had a list of Catholics represent, so they'd go around and check on them regularly. You had a priest there, you'd say to the priest, go and hide in the priest hole. They would, you wouldn't find them. But the trouble is, in then come the people and they ask you and they say, have you got a priest in this house? How do you answer without condemning yourself or lying? You equivocate. And here was a guide to ways you can equivocate. You can say something without lying, but sound like you're saying something else. And there were basically 4 ways of lying here. And you'll see examples of these, some of them in Macbeth more than others. But this is why it outraged people. First of all, there was the idea of ambiguous language. Okay? There is no priest lying in this house, they say, because lie can mean two words. Priest isn't telling any lie. There you go. Right? Ridiculous, I know, but in the world of 17th century religion, apparently that was allowed. Omitting information. I am going to so-and-so's house for dinner, but I'm not mentioning I'm going for a service as well. Right? That's the kind of thing. Not saying everything you need to. Apparently, again, not counts lying. This one's always quite comical. It relies on you having quite large sleeves, okay, as they had on their shirts or something. You mix word and gesture. There's nobody over there. Put your hands in your sleeve and you're actually pointing that way. Yeah. Bizarre. I mean, honestly, it just sounds comical, doesn't it? But here's the one that actually caused the biggest issue. Mental reservation. The idea is that you can finish a sentence in your head because God knows everything. So you're not lying to God, but you're not saying it out loud. Right? Is there a priest in the house? There's no priest in the house, my own head finishing off with, until earlier on today. But I don't stay at home now. And God hears me, so everything's okay. Now, this got people really wound up. And in fact, one of the people who was most picked on for the gunpowder plot was a man called Father Garnet, Henry Garnet, who was mentioned briefly on a previous one before, who was a Jesuit missionary who had been sent over. And what he did was he was arrested, even though actually he did know about the gunpowder plot, but he actually wrote to some people trying to get them to forbid it to happen. Mostly because he thought it would be dreadful for the other Catholics in the country. He thought everyone would turn on them. So he thought it was a dreadful idea. But still, he got arrested and blamed for it. But the real thing about it was equivocation. He had written that pamphlet. And therefore, they quizzed him on that. Okay? And suddenly it became part of the whole problem that people were equivocating. This is what Catholics do. They're lying to us. They're tricking us. Our equivocation is at the heart of Macbeth. And that's the key thing here for you. The obvious example is the witches. Everything the witches predict is equivocated. Okay? From the obvious examples at each examples at the beginning. Number one, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor. He immediately takes that as, you're predicting I'm going to be Thane of Cawdor. It comes true. And that means you know everything. But what it actually said is, you are Thane of Cawdor. And as we know as well as the audience, at that point, he is. We've just seen it being given to him. So we're aware that that is not actually a prophecy. It's just the truth. We know it as well. Hail to thee that shalt be king hereafter. That just literally means at any point in the future. They are aware that what they're doing will lead to Macbeth taking things into his own hands. So they're encouraging him through equivocation. It gets even worse with the prophecies later, which of course you'll spot. Not only is it, when he says none of woman born shall harm Macbeth, technically none of woman born shall, somebody who's actually not technically born, but ripped out of the mother's womb instead. It's all a bit gentle. And in fact, if you look at the scene, and this is something very, very effective to use, if you look at the scene where they predict it, Act 4, Scene 1, the witches don't tell him. I hope most of you remember this. The witches don't actually give the prophecies. They conjure up apparitions, give the prophecies. And those apparitions give away what the truth is. None of woman born shall harm Macbeth is told by a bloody child. So literally a child that has been taken out of wood. So it's there in your face, right? The whole thing about Burnham Wood coming up against Dunstane is told by a child crowned holding a branch. Malcolm, child of Duncan, wearing a crown because he's going to be king, holding a branch because that's literally how he does it, remember? So everything's presented truthfully in there, but they know it's not going to be taken over. So the whole idea of equivocation, that means the witches are associated with equivocation. That means they are associated with Catholicism. That is the potential thing that we look at there. Then we have Lady Macbeth. Remember, Lady Macbeth's first speech, first soliloquy. Hie thee hither, and I will pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise thee with the valour of my tongue. I will use my words to manipulate you. Equivocate. I will equivocate. So again, the person who is pushing for this to happen is associated with equivocation. Macbeth himself begins to equivocate, starting relatively early. Remember Banquo in Act 2, Scene 1, turns around to him and says, I dreamt last night of the weird sisters. To you they've shown some truth. Macbeth goes, I think not of them. That sounds like a barefaced lie, but if you pull it apart, you could call it equivocation. I don't think of them. Right? I just talk about them a lot. You know, again, he's constantly using that kind of an idea. But, and this is where I'm going somewhere which I think you can use with it. If this was just about anti-Catholic sentiment, there's obviously something there, but if it was just about that, then surely it would only be the evil characters who would equivocate. But by the end of the play, everybody is. Everybody is. In that scene that goes on forever, in Act 4, one set in England, Malcolm starts equivocating. Remember that really bizarre situation that goes on forever with Macduff, when he's testing Macduff, saying, you know, I would be an awful king, I'd be worse than Macbeth. And he tells him all this stuff about what he would be like, and then at the end goes, actually, I was lying. Oh, actually, I wasn't telling the truth. That wouldn't happen at all. In fact, that's the first lie I ever told. He's equivocating for his own good, but he's learnt the skill of it. Ross, the messenger, throughout the play, somebody who, I think you'll find this elsewhere, I've often argued before, is the conscience of the play. Ross equivocates. Remember when he brings the news to Macduff that his children are dead? He doesn't say they are. Macduff says to him, how are my children and my wife? He says they're well. Not a barefaced lie. It's playing on the word well. And he keeps that going for a little bit before he admits the truth. And finally, even Macduff begins to equivocate. There's a really chilling line in the play after that bit where, having found out what's happened to his family, he says, he has no children. Now, is that him just saying, so he doesn't understand, or how awful it would be there? Or is he actually making a little ploy at how he'd like to take revenge? He's got no children for me to take revenge on. He's not speaking straightforwardly, you could even argue there. So what we could argue is that equivocation, I won't make it a whole answer, but the part of it is something that develops through the play in everybody. So is Shakespeare actually looking at the idea of it, saying, yes, it's awful, but then saying, but it happens, but it's effective technique. When we come to the conclusion you see there in the end, that's the question we're asking ourselves. Do we read this play as an attack on Catholicism purely to further Shakespeare's political standing? There's plenty of evidence for it. Why write a play? Why write Macbeth at this point if you're not trying to write about your Scottish king? Okay. Why include the supernatural so much? The supernatural was associated with Catholicism anyway because of the rituals and the reliance on the saints and things like that. People thought of Catholicism as tied in. People who didn't like it anyway, tied in with the supernatural. And the fact that the supernatural, it could be argued to be the antagonist of the play, is that, again, that seems to be suggesting to us that he's really attacking Catholicism here. There's the porter. You don't often consider him, do you? But you remember the porter who claims he's the porter of Hell's Gate, right? So essentially, with Macbeth and his murder of the king, he has now become the gate to hell. But then, in that really bizarre speech that the porter does, which seems to make no sense, he starts going on about equivocation. He starts going on about Father Garnet, Henry Garnet. He brings him up. He calls him, because one of his nicknames was the Farmer Garnet. And he mentions this farmer who could not equivocate to heaven, and so has ended up in the other place. It's a direct reference to it. It's mocking him, right? Again, is that part of it? And then all that stuff about hell and damnation. The people who commit these crimes are going to hell. Again, denying the idea that, like the gunpowder plotters, they were doing it for a righteous religious reason. So we've got all of that evidence there. But as I was saying to you with that equivocation and where it goes, I think we have to take a more balanced view. A much more balanced view of this. And I think if you're going to write about Macbeth, this is a good thing to think about as a motivation for what he's doing. But there's more going on. Think how central to the play guilt is. Guilt's a really Catholic thing, right? Okay? And it's central to the play. It's a tragedy. So no matter how much the supernatural are involved, it is the story of Macbeth falling from grace because of his own decisions. It follows the plot of a tragedy. So that would easily go against what we're talking about. There's Duncan himself, who is portrayed, yes, as a Scottish king who gets murdered, but one who's not trusting of people, who's too trusting of people, one who's not effective as a king in many ways, even if he's liked. But that wouldn't suggest he's sucking up to Malcolm, would it? And then there's that very strange bit that I'm sure you probably don't remember. You may not even have studied it, but go and look at it. In the middle, again, that interminable scene in Act 4, where the English king is briefly mentioned. He would be able to confess at the time. Never said. The English king, who apparently can perform miracles, cure people of evil. It's got nothing to do with the rest of the play, and it happens in the middle of it. Is this giving us a more balanced view of what the play's about? There's more going on. Positive supernatural aspects. You see, the thing is, Shakespeare is never simple. He never sits down and just does the obvious, which is one of the reasons he survived so long. And so to dismiss Macbeth as a play that is a response to the gunpowder plot is simplistic. Essentially, yes, anti-Catholic sentiment clearly influences Macbeth, particularly in political texture. You couldn't miss it at the time. You couldn't miss what was going on, particularly in the whole stuff of equivocation and damnation. You can't miss it. It's definitely there. But guilt is more of a universal psychological force than anything particular to anything like that. It's a play about guilt. It's a play about a man who does do this, but then is tortured by his guilt for what he does. Rather than sectarian propaganda, pro-Protestant, anti-Catholic, it's got so much more going on in it. The gunpowder plot is vital, it's central, it's important, but it isn't everything in there. Don't keep it that simplistic. Okay. Thank you very much.